Okay, here to talk about Korea's experience with rising inequality and inclusive growth. The Asian Development Outlook that Joe mentioned was under embargo until yesterday, so I was trying to guess what the content would be. I just finished up last night after going through the report and everything. Now, this is a single case example, so it's limited, but at the same time, the benefit of using Korea as a case study is that everything is compressed. Development, aging, as well as changing inequality dynamics. So I think it'll have a lot of implications for developing Asian countries. When we tackle rising inequality and inclusive growth, I think there are some conceptual issues to think about first. How does inequality rise, for instance? And 4 factors have to be considered. Initial distribution of endowments, things like power, wealth, and merits. So you have, on merits, you have innate capacity, nature versus nurture debate. And ideally, you would like to have socially efficient meritocracy so that, overall, the size of the pie would be maximized, but at the same time, the distribution side would be managed so that people share equally or at least equitably the benefits of this system. Economists have talked about the next 2 factors: trade, things like factor price equalization, Stolper-Samuelson, and dynamic learning effects, and technical change, skill bias technical change. And beneath all this is the political economy and endogeneity of institutions, because policy responses to the changes in trade patterns and technological progress have been rather different. So, for instance, Paul Krugman has been having a debate with himself for more than 20 years, right? Whether trade is more important, political economies, technical change is more important. But when you look at his book, The Conscience of a Liberal, he concludes that a lot of advanced economies face the same changing trade patterns and technological progress patterns, but outcomes in the United States as opposed to Canada and European countries have been rather different. So he emphasizes the political economy and endogeneity of institutions in his book. Now, when we get to policy issues, responses to rising inequality deal with these approaches. For instance, horizontal versus vertical approach, whether we will emphasize broad-based growth or we would target the poor. Ex ante versus ex post approach, where more emphasis is placed on empowerment, including education, human capital development, and so on, versus taxation and redistribution of income. And sectoral strategy, some people argue that it's important to reinforce a sector that's predominantly poor, things like agriculture. But if you think about it, that may not be the best strategy, because by going for sectoral reallocation, you may be able to increase the size of the pie and have broad-based growth, right? So it's not obvious that focusing on a poor-dominated sector is an optimal strategy. And financing and investment, and finally the issue of governance, how the political system responds to these changes in trade and technology. Okay, now when we talk about East Asia, we have this notion of rapid shared growth. So when the ADB comes out and says we need to confront rising inequality, this is something of a surprise to some people, right? This one comes from the World Bank's East Asian Miracle Study. So if you look at countries like the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Japan, and so on, it's in the upper left-hand corner. So it's marked by rapid growth, but at the same time, as measured by the quintile ratios, it has tended, the East Asian countries have tended to have a fairly equitable income distribution. So that's the picture we have of Asia, at least from like 1965 through 1989. But as Joe mentioned, things have been changing somewhat over the past 2 decades, and Gini coefficient has been rising in many countries. And urban Gini coefficient in countries like China has been have been rising as well. So it's not just the urban-rural gap, but also within city inequality that's rising in some countries. So what do you do about that is the a challenge for policymakers these days. Now, if we now shift to Korea's experience with dealing with rising inequality and promoting inclusive growth, we can respond to some of the questions I raised at the outset. For instance, for sectoral composition of Korea's GDP, as you can see, Korea was a predominantly agriculture and mining-centered country back in the 50s and in the early 60s. But that sector declined in terms of GDP share. But at the same time, Korea, as you know, rose from one of the poorest countries to a member of the OECD. So it's not necessarily the case that reinforcing poor-dominated sector is the optimal strategy for developing countries. Exports, imports, and investment. What really is striking about Korea's experience in this regard is that back in the 50s, Korea's exports as a percentage of GDP was less than 5%. So it was not a very trade-heavy country, and in fact, during that time, a lot of development economists spoke against trade. But since the early 1960s, Korea has engaged extensively in trade, and using its comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturers, what it tended to do was to import capital goods from overseas. So investment as percentage of GDP rose in a similar fashion as imports as a percentage of GDP, and then Korea used its cheap but well-educated labor force to generate labor-intensive products, right? And then grew. So. And as far as inflation, unemployment, and growth patterns are concerned, although there was some problem of inflation back in the 70s, Korea on the whole managed to maintain low rate of unemployment and fairly moderate rate of inflation, and suffered very little from growth shocks. Okay. Now let's move to some of the policy issues. We talked about empowerment versus redistribution, and Joe emphasized the importance of investing in people, education, and so on. And in Korea's experience, back in the 50s, Korea invested heavily in its people, even when it was very poor. And one thing I would emphasize with regard to this is that there was a prior land reform and flattening of the traditional hierarchy. So that created expectations that if you work hard and study hard, that you could move ahead in society. So it wasn't just school reform, accountability reform that provided the basis for this rapid education improvement and also a human capital improvement. But there was also this social expectation for mobility that was very conducive to human resource development. And what you notice is that education increased greatly in the 50s, but until complementary developments in industrial and trade policy took place in the 60s, there was very little movement in per capita income. Okay. Now, in terms of Korea's source of funding for its economic growth, it changed very dramatically back in the 40s and 50s. Most of foreign capital inflow into Korea was in the form of United States and United Nations grants. So foreign aid accounted for basically almost all of foreign capital inflows. But then Korea shifted to relying on foreign loans, because now you may suffer a debt crisis if you fail to pay back foreign loans. But at the same time, it gives an opportunity, a chance for developing countries to take advantage of the domestic and international rate differential and be the residual claimant on the fruits of the investments if the investments turn out to be productive. So that was a strategy Korea followed since the 60s. And instead of relying on aid, and instead of relying on foreign direct investment, which gives the residual claims to foreign investors, Korea tended to rely on foreign loans. Okay. And domestic resource mobilization greatly increased policy space for Korea. In fact, the tax revenue as percentage of GDP increased a great deal back in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s. And that gave the government more autonomy to deal with things like rising inequality. And Korea used foreign capital productively. So instead of simply subsidizing consumption with reparation funds from Japan, for example, Korea allocated funds to facilitate self-sustaining growth, investing in manufacturing, science and technology, and infrastructure. And by the late 1960s, there were two major challenges that Korea faced. One was sort of a low rate of domestic value added, because Korea was basically importing raw materials and capital goods from overseas and combine that with cheap and well-educated labor to produce labor-intensive manufactures. But the value added domestically was very low, so that was a concern. The other concern was rising inequality, especially urban-rural income gap. In 1963, per capita income in rural and urban households was at parity, basically, but in the second half of the 1960s, it began to widen dramatically. So by 1970, rural households were earning only 2/3 of urban households. So that became a problem, and Korea responded with what is known as Saemaul Undong, the new community movement and rural development. And the core elements of Saemaul Undong were three: community empowerment under diligence, self-help, and cooperation. So local decision-making was emphasized. Voluntary contributions were emphasized. There was also peer inspiration and knowledge sharing. So you will learn from other villages with similar endowments that were more successful than yourselves through study tours and training sessions, so that there will be peer inspiration and learning. And finally, performance-based support from the government. For instance, when Saemaul Undong started in 1970, the government provided each of 33,000 villages in Korea with cement and other construction materials, and let each village decide for themselves their best use for the good of the community, right? Building bridges and stuff. And in 1971, the next year, the government provided more construction materials, but only to those villages that had achieved good results in the first year. So it wasn't, just free handout, but rather performance-based reward idea was built in. And there was also a linkage between Saemaul Undong and other programs, things like Green Revolution and Silver or White Revolution, meaning that new varieties were introduced, new varieties of rice and so on, and greenhouses, which were silver in color, were introduced so that they could grow vegetables and fruits out of season. And finally, something more controversial, something like a dual grain price system was introduced. In 1967, in the presidential election, the widening urban-rural gap was a huge election issue. And the opposition called for a dual grain price system where the government would procure grain from farmers at a higher price and then sell to urban workers, consumers, at a lower price. So that, that creates trouble for the public finance. But this system was adopted in Japan and other countries where there was this urban-rural gap. And the Korean government itself adopted that in the late 1960s and early 1970s to provide income support to rural households. This picture shows a town hall meeting among rural villagers, selecting Saemaul leaders and so on. The picture in the middle is President Park Chung-hee. This is a dictatorial period. And this shows the contribution by villagers versus government support. And as you can see in the total, it was basically 50-50. So it wasn't total, it wasn't entire government support that drove this process. One prominent example of improvement in rural infrastructure was rural access road. And prior to building this bridge and access road, people would put things on their back and carry like that on the left hand side. But after after the building of this road. They could use a truck or a tractor and so on. So there was a huge improvement in productivity. And rice yields, when you compare Japan and Korea, there was a huge gap in the early 1960s. But thanks to Green Revolution and other productivity improving innovations, Korea caught up with Japan. And thanks to all these efforts, urban and rural income gap basically closed by the late 1970s. Okay. And the other challenge I mentioned was industrial upgrading and domestic linkages. So in order to raise domestic value added, what Korea basically did was to not only invest in things like infrastructure, but went massively into R&D. So back in the early 1970s, total R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP for Korea was less than 0.5, and about 4/5 of the R&D expenditure was borne by the government. But as Korean companies, private sector companies, were exposed to global competition and came to realize that innovation was key to their prosperity, they dramatically increased their R&D expenditures and caught up with the public sector by 1982. And by that time, the total R&D as a percentage of GDP reached 1%. And now Korea's total R&D is about more than 3.5% of GDP. Okay. Now, Korea has pretty much gone beyond this developing country stage by the late 1980s, and Korea's per capita income continues to converge, as you can see from this PPP graph. And income inequality dynamic has changed quite a bit. I emphasized that back in the 1960s, with the rapid rise of labor-intensive manufacturing, there was a widening urban-rural gap, which Saemaul Undong tried to address. And what happened in the 1980s and beyond is very interesting. As you can see, Gini coefficient fell quite a bit after Korea's democratization in 1987, as people began to call for more shared growth and so on. But then after the 1997-98 Asian economic crisis, it rose dramatically. And it's staying at a sort of somewhat elevated level. So it's a huge policy issue these days in Korea. And what's interesting is that back in the 60s and 70s, Korea was confronting questions like factor price equalization and so on as one of the countries catching up, right? But now it's not so clear, right? There are other late developing countries that are catching up with Korea, even as Korea is catching up with Japan, Germany, and the United States. And this picture shows how Korea's employment structure is changing. On the horizontal axis, you see employment in the manufacturing sector, and on the vertical axis, you see a share of employment in the services sector. Now, throughout the 1980s, employment in the manufacturing sector rose as a share of the total, right? But around the time of the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the normalization of relations between Korea and China in 1992, things began to change dramatically. So labor-intensive manufacturing became less and less viable for Korea. And then even though value added contributed by the manufacturing stayed at a high level, employment suffered as labor-intensive manufacturing was rationalized. And in an international comparison, Korea stands out with Nordic countries with a competitive advantage in IT, things like Sweden and Finland, in that manufacturing value added increased, but at the same time, share of employment in the manufacturing declined. Okay. And this changed industrial dynamic creates problems for income distribution. Although Korea is supposed to be one of these countries that led rapid and shared growth, if you look at OECD countries these days, Korea is one of actually worst performers, bad performers in terms of relative poverty rates and income inequality. And in terms of social expenditure, Korea is near the bottom. And another question that is faced by Korea is that In 2009, it's the fourth youngest country in the OECD region. But by 2050, due to rapid aging, Korea will be the second oldest country in the OECD region. So that kind of compressed demographic changes are causing a nightmare for policymakers, and Korea now has to deal with all these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.